In the modern global economy, some of the most important decisions are no longer made in isolation. They are made inside supply chains, inside trade agreements, and inside industrial ecosystems that stretch across continents. And in this scenario, the electric vehicle industry becomes the center of a much larger question. Who controls the future of automotive manufacturing, not just in production, but in policy, in trade law, and in global industrial alignment? For more than a century, the automotive industry was dominated by a relatively stable structure: design in one country, manufacturing in another, assembly in regional hubs, and distribution across global markets. But that structure is now changing rapidly. The shift to electric vehicles has rewritten the rules, because EV production is not just about assembly lines. It is about battery chemistry, mineral supply chains, semiconductor integration, software systems, energy infrastructure, industrial policy coordination, and that means no single country can control the entire system alone. Instead, what emerges is a distributed network of dependencies: lithium from one region, nickel from another, battery cell production in specialized hubs, vehicle assembly in large industrial zones, and software development spread across global tech centers. In this environment, trade relationships become more sensitive, because supply chains are not just commercial, they are strategic. And when something becomes strategic, it also becomes political. Now imagine a scenario where a major EV procurement agreement is announced, not as a single contract, but as part of a broader shift in sourcing strategy, involving tens of thousands of electric vehicles over a multi-year period, a scale large enough to attract attention across multiple governments, not because of one deal alone, but because of what it represents. On one level, this kind of agreement reflects simple economics. Countries and companies are seeking lower production costs, faster EV adoption, expanded supply options, competitive pricing in a rapidly scaling market. China, as one of the largest EV producers in the world, naturally plays a major role in this ecosystem. Its manufacturing capacity is extensive, its battery production infrastructure is highly developed, and its supply chain integration is deeply optimized for scale. Canada, meanwhile, sits in a different position in the global EV landscape. It is not only a consumer market, it is also a resource hub. With significant reserves of critical minerals used in battery production, including nickel and other key inputs, Canada plays a strategic upstream role in the EV value chain. This creates a structural link between resource extraction, processing, and final manufacturing. But in modern trade systems, upstream and downstream sectors are tightly connected. A shift in procurement strategy at one end of the chain can influence industrial policy at the other, and that is where trade tensions often emerge, not in finished products alone, but in the structure of the supply chain itself. Now introduce the legal layer, because global trade does not operate purely on market logic. It operates within frameworks of agreements, tariffs, exceptions, and dispute resolution systems. These frameworks determine what tariffs can be applied, under what conditions they are valid, how disputes are resolved, what exemptions may exist, and how trade retaliation is structured when a government imposes counter tariffs. Those measures are typically grounded in specific legal justifications: trade imbalance concerns, national security considerations, domestic industry protection, or retaliatory mechanisms under existing agreements. However, these measures are not absolute. They are subject to challenge, review, and interpretation under international trade law. This is where complexity increases, because legality in trade disputes is not always immediate or unilateral. It often depends on prior agreements, classification of goods, supply chain origin rules, documentation compliance, and arbitration outcomes. So when headlines suggest that a tariff has no legal ground left to stand on, what is actually being referenced is usually a contested interpretation of trade law, not an immediate legal collapse, but a dispute over justification. In this scenario, that dispute becomes part of a larger strategic environment, because EV trade is not just about vehicles, it is about industrial positioning for the next several decades. Governments are no longer simply reacting to trade flows, they are actively shaping them, through incentives, through tariffs, through industrial policy, and through strategic partnerships. And companies are responding accordingly, by diversifying supply chains, by relocating production capacity, by adjusting sourcing strategies, and by hedging against policy uncertainty. This creates a feedback loop. Policy influences supply chains influence policy, and both evolve together over time. Now consider the symbolic scale of a 49,000 vehicle procurement scenario. In isolation, it is a commercial transaction, but in a geopolitical context, it becomes something more, a signal of demand direction, a reflection of supply chain trust, and an indicator of industrial alignment. However, it is important to emphasize a key reality. Global EV trade is not zero-sum. One country's imports do not automatically represent another country's loss, because the EV supply chain is globally fragmented, with multiple participants at every stage of production. Battery materials may originate in one country, cells may be produced in another, software may be developed elsewhere, and final assembly may occur in yet another region. So trade wins and losses are often oversimplified. What actually changes is positioning within the value chain. Who captures upstream value? Who captures manufacturing value? Who captures software value? And who captures end market value? This is why EV trade is so strategically important, because it is not just about vehicles. It is about where economic value is created in a new industrial system. As the scenario develops, the focus shifts from individual transactions to structural trends. Supply chain diversification, industrial policy competition, trade law interpretation, energy transition economics, and regional manufacturing strategy. Each of these forces interacts with the others, and together they shape the direction of the global EV economy. In this environment, tariffs are not simply tools of protection, they are tools of negotiation, tools of leverage, and tools of industrial strategy. But they are also constrained by legal frameworks that evolve slowly and require interpretation. This is why trade disputes rarely produce clean outcomes. Instead, they produce negotiated adjustments, policy revisions, partial compromises, and long-term structural shifts. So the central question in this scenario is not whether one deal changes everything, it is how one deal fits into a larger transformation already underway. A transformation where EV supply chains are being rebuilt in real time, where countries are competing for industrial relevance, and where trade law is being continuously tested against economic reality. And in that environment, the most important advantage is rarely short-term dominance, it is adaptability. Because the future of the EV industry will not be defined by a single agreement, but by which countries and companies adjust fastest to a system that is still being. As the electric vehicle sector expands globally, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The conversation shifts. At first, it is about vehicles, then it becomes about factories, and eventually it becomes about control of the underlying system that produces those vehicles. Because in the EV era, the most important competition is no longer happening on dealership floors. It is happening far upstream, in mining regions, in refining plants, in battery gigafactories, and in trade ministries interpreting rules that were never designed for this level of industrial complexity. In this scenario, the idea of a large-scale EV procurement agreement becomes more than a commercial story. It becomes a stress test for the global system, not because one deal changes everything, but because it interacts with an already fragile balance between trade law, industrial policy, and geopolitical strategy. To understand why, you have to look at how EV supply chains are structured. Unlike traditional automotive production, where engines and transmissions were the core components, electric vehicles are built around energy storage systems. And those systems depend on globally distributed inputs: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earth materials, each sourced from different regions, each processed in different jurisdictions, and each subject to different regulatory environments. This fragmentation creates opportunity, but it also creates dependency, because no single country can fully isolate itself from the broader network. Even the most advanced manufacturing economies rely on international inputs for critical components. This is where trade policy becomes central, because when supply chains are globally distributed, tariffs do not just affect finished goods, they affect every layer of production: mining, processing, component manufacturing, assembly, and final export. A tariff on EVs, for example, does not only impact car imports, it can also influence battery pricing, mineral demand, investment flows into refining capacity, supplier contracts across multiple countries. This is why trade disputes in the EV sector tend to escalate quickly, not because of ideology, but because of interconnected impact. In this scenario, attention turns to counter-tariff mechanisms. These are tools governments use to respond to perceived trade imbalances or policy disputes. They are typically justified under domestic industry protection, trade agreement enforcement, national economic security, or reciprocal policy measures. However, the effectiveness of tariffs depends heavily on legal structure, because modern trade agreements include detailed rules governing product classification, country of origin requirements, exemption criteria, dispute resolution procedures, timelines for appeal or review. This creates a complex legal environment where outcomes are not immediate. They are interpreted, reviewed, and often contested. So when public discussion suggests that a tariff has no legal standing, what is usually happening is not a sudden invalidation. It is a legal challenge entering a formal review process where interpretation of trade rules becomes central. And in that process, timing matters as much as substance. Because trade law is procedural, deadlines, filings, and review windows often determine how quickly or slowly disputes evolve. Meanwhile, the industrial side of the system continues operating. Factories do not pause for legal clarification. Supply chains continue to function. Contracts remain active unless explicitly suspended. And companies continue making decisions based on expected, not resolved outcomes. This creates a gap between legal systems and economic systems. And that gap is where uncertainty lives. Uncertainty is one of the most powerful forces in global trade because it changes behavior before outcomes are finalized. It alters investment timelines. It shifts sourcing decisions, and it forces companies to prepare for multiple scenarios simultaneously. In the EV industry, this effect is amplified because production cycles are long, capital investment is high, and supply chain transitions are expensive. So even small signals in trade policy can trigger large strategic adjustments, not because companies expect immediate disruption, but because they are managing risk exposure across multi-year planning cycles. This is where industrial strategy becomes visible. Countries are no longer just reacting to trade flows, they are actively shaping them through subsidies, through tax incentives, through infrastructure investment, and through trade enforcement mechanisms. At the same time, companies are no longer passive participants, they are strategic actors. They choose locations based on policy stability, market access, supply chain proximity, energy costs, regulatory predictability. This creates a multi-layered system where decisions are influenced by both economics and geopolitics simultaneously. In this scenario, the EV procurement narrative becomes symbolic of that system, not because of its size alone, but because of what it reflects. A global market in transition, where traditional trade assumptions are being reevaluated. One of the most important shifts is the growing importance of supply chain sovereignty. Countries increasingly want control over critical inputs, not necessarily full independence, but reduced vulnerability. This leads to new industrial policies focused on domestic battery production, regional mineral refining, strategic stockpiling, trade diversification, and investment attraction for EV ecosystems. However, sovereignty in a global supply chain is never absolute, because the EV industry is inherently interconnected. Even vertically integrated companies rely on global inputs. This is why competition in the EV sector is not about isolation. It is about positioning, where each country fits into the global value chain and how much value it captures at each stage. As this scenario continues, the focus shifts away from individual deals and towards systemic transformation, because the EV revolution is not just a technological shift. It is a restructuring of global industrial geography, and in that restructuring, trade law becomes a central battleground, not as a tool of confrontation, but as a framework for negotiating how the new system operates, because every tariff, exemption, and trade ruling contributes to defining where factories are built, how supply chains are organized, which countries attract investment, and how value is distributed globally. So the real impact of any major EV-related trade dispute is not immediate disruption. It is long-term repositioning. And that repositioning unfolds slowly through legal interpretation, industrial adaptation, and strategic recalibration across multiple economies, which is why the most important outcome is rarely the initial announcement. It is the system that emerges afterward. A system still evolving, still balancing competing interests, and still defining the rules of the next industrial era. As the EV transition continues unfolding in this scenario, the conversation gradually shifts away from disputes, tariffs, and individual deals, and moves towards something larger, a structural question, not who is winning today, but who is positioned to matter tomorrow. Because in global industrial systems, the most important changes are rarely visible in the short term. They are embedded in long-term infrastructure decisions, factories being built today, mining projects being approved today, battery plants being financed today, trade agreements being interpreted today. All of these decisions lock in economic pathways that can last for decades, and once those pathways are established, they become difficult to reverse. This is why EV supply chains are often described as path-dependent, meaning the early structure of the system shapes everything that follows, where minerals are extracted, where processing happens, where batteries are manufactured, and where final assembly takes place. Each decision reinforces the next. In this environment, countries are no longer simply competing for exports. They are competing for positions inside the value chain. Because value is not distributed evenly across production stages, some stages create more economic return than others. Upstream stages like mining and refining are essential, but midstream and downstream stages, battery manufacturing, software integration, vehicle assembly, often capture higher value-added returns. This creates strategic competition over where those stages are located, and that competition is not just economic, it is political. Because governments recognize that industrial structure determines long-term employment, tax revenue, and technological capability, so policy begins to shift, not just toward encouraging EV adoption, but toward controlling how EVs are produced, through incentives, through trade rules, through domestic content requirements, and through strategic partnerships. At the same time, corporations respond to these incentives with their own strategic adjustments. They do not simply follow markets. They follow policy environments, because policy determines profitability over the long term. This creates a global feedback loop. Government policy influences investment. Investment influences supply chains. Supply chains influence trade flows, and trade flows influence future policy. In this loop, no single actor has full control, not governments, not corporations, not trade agreements. Instead, control is distributed across a network of interdependent decisions. This is why EV trade disputes often appear more complex than traditional trade conflicts, because they are not about a single product category, they are about system design, a system that includes energy production, mineral extraction, industrial manufacturing, software development, logistics networks, financial settlement system. Each layer interacts with the others, and each layer evolves at a different speed. This asynchronous evolution creates friction, because policy can change faster than infrastructure, and infrastructure can change faster than supply chains, and supply chains can change faster than institutions. That mismatch is where most trade tension originates, not from disagreement alone, but from different speeds of adaptation. In this scenario, the EV procurement narrative reflects that tension, not as a single defining event, but as one example of how global demand signals interact with industrial policy and trade law. Because when large-scale procurement decisions occur in a rapidly evolving industry, they send signals through the entire system, signals about demand direction, signals about supply chain trust, signals about long-term strategic alignment, and markets interpret those signals immediately, even if the legal or political implications take much longer to resolve. This is one of the defining features of modern global trade. Markets move on expectations, governments move on procedures, and industries move on investment cycles. The interaction of those timelines creates constant adjustment, sometimes subtle, sometimes significant, but always ongoing. In the EV sector, this adjustment is especially intense because the industry is still forming. Unlike mature industries with stable supply chains, EV manufacturing is still evolving its global structure. That means new production hubs are emerging, old supply chains are being redesigned, technological standards are still shifting, and trade relationships are still being renegotiated in real time. In this kind of environment, uncertainty is not an anomaly, it is the baseline condition. And countries that adapt fastest to uncertainty often gain disproportionate advantage, not because they control the system, but because they respond to it more effectively. This is why industrial policy has become central to EV competition. Governments are no longer passive regulators. They are active participants in shaping industrial outcomes. They influence where factories are built, which companies receive subsidies, how supply chains are structured, and how trade agreements are interpreted and enforced. But even with this influence, outcomes are not fully controllable, because global markets are interconnected, and interconnection limits unilateral control. So what emerges is a balancing act between national strategy and global dependency, between industrial ambition and supply chain reality, between policy goals and market behavior, and that balancing act defines the modern EV era. As the scenario concludes, the most important insight is not about any single trade dispute or procurement agreement. It is about the system those events operate within. A system where technology evolves quickly, trade law evolves slowly, supply chains evolve unevenly, and policy constantly tries to align them. And in that system, the true competition is not about individual deals. It is about shaping the structure in which all deals are made. Because once the structure is established, it determines where value is created, who captures economic gains, and how global industries evolve over time. So the final takeaway is simple. The EV revolution is not just a technological shift. It is a structural transformation of global economic power. And in that transformation, the most important advantage is not size. It is positioning. Because in a system still being built, the countries that define the rules, infrastructure, and supply chain architecture will influence the next generation of global industry far beyond any single transaction or announcement.